The first time Margaret Holloway understood that her brothers were going to take everything. She was standing in the kitchen of the farmhouse where she had been born, holding a coffee cup that no longer belonged to her. It was a Tuesday in late September, and the light through the window over the sink had that particular gold quality that only happens in Nebraska in the fall, the kind of light that makes a person remember every good thing that has ever happened to them. Maggie was 72 years old. Her husband Daniel had been dead for 3 years. Her father had been dead for 6 weeks. And her 2 younger brothers, Clyde and Wendell, were sitting at the kitchen table across from her, explaining in calm, reasonable voices that she would be leaving by the end of the month. Clyde did most of the talking. He had always been the one who did most of the talking. He was 68 now, thick through the chest and shoulders, with a face that had gone ruddy from 40 years of whiskey and wind. He wore the same kind of pearl-snap shirt their father had worn, and he carried himself the same way. And Maggie had long ago stopped being able to tell whether she loved him or pitied him or just tolerated him, because he was the only older brother she had left. Wendell was younger by 2 years and quieter by nature. He sat beside Clyde with his hands folded on the oilcloth, staring at his knuckles as if the words being spoken had nothing to do with him. But Maggie knew better. Wendell had always been the one who nodded when Clyde spoke. That was his whole life, in a sentence. He nodded when Clyde spoke. The papers were spread between them on the table. Clyde had brought them in a manila folder, and he had lined them up with the care of a man who had spent a long time practicing how he would lay them down. There was a will. There was a survey. There was a document from the county assessor, and another from a lawyer in Grand Island whose name Maggie had never heard before. Clyde tapped the will with one square, dirt-stained finger. "Now, Margaret," he said, in that voice he used when he was trying to sound like their father. Daddy was real clear about what he wanted. "The working land goes to me and Wendell. That's 460 acres, give or take, of tillable ground, plus the pasture, plus the cattle, plus all the equipment in the machine shed. That's how he wanted it. That's how it's going to be." Maggie set the coffee cup down on the counter. Her hand was steady. She had promised herself, walking in from the driveway that morning, that her hand would be steady. "Daddy told me 100 times," she said, "that the farm would be split 3 ways. Clyde smiled. It was not a cruel smile, exactly. It was the smile of a man who had already won and who wanted the losing to be gentle, because gentle losing would be easier on everyone, especially on him. "Daddy told a lot of people a lot of things, Max. But the will says what the will says. And the will says the operation goes to the sons, and the homestead goes to you." "The homestead," Maggie repeated. "The old place. Up on the ridge. It's been yours on paper since 1998, you know that. Daddy put it in your name after you married Daniel, in case Daniel ever needed to be off this land for tax purposes. It's yours. Free and clear. No mortgage, no lien, nothing. It's a gift, Mags. He wanted you to have it." Maggie looked out the window above the sink. She could see, in the far distance, the roof of the old place. It sat on the rise where the original Holloway sod house had stood in 1887, replaced by a proper 2-story farmhouse in 1891, added on it twice, shingled 3 times, and finally abandoned by her grandfather Thaddeus in 1962 when he built the newer house down in the flat where she was currently standing. The old place had been empty for 63 years. The roof leaked in 4 places. The porch had rotted off the front. There was a great hollow in the kitchen floor where the joists had given up sometime during the Reagan administration. No one had lived there since before she was old enough to remember. Her father had used it for storage. Her grandfather, toward the end of his life, had forbidden anyone from going inside. "A gift," she said. "It's a roof over your head," Clyde said. "That's more than a lot of folks have." Wendell cleared his throat. "We'll help you get it cleaned up, Maggie. Me and Clyde will come up on weekends." Clyde gave him a look that could have scoured a cast-iron pan, and Wendell went back to staring at his knuckles. Maggie understood, in that moment, that there would be no help. There would not be a weekend, or an afternoon, or an hour. Her brothers would drop her at the old place with whatever she could fit in the bed of her pickup, and they would never come up that driveway again unless they wanted something. She sat down slowly at the table across from them. Her hip was bad on the left side, and sitting down had become, in the last year, a project she undertook deliberately. "Where am I supposed to sleep?" she said. "That house isn't fit for living. You know that. There's no water, the wiring's from the Eisenhower years, and half the upstairs floor is gone. We'll get you a generator, Clyde said. And we got some boards left over from the hog shed. It won't be fancy, Mags, but it'll be yours. And this place, he gestured around the kitchen, at the checked curtains her mother had sewn in 1971, at the wood stove her father had installed when she was 14, at the long pine table where 6 decades of Holloway suppers had been eaten. This place needs to be the operation headquarters. That's all. It's a business decision. Nothing personal. Maggie looked at him for a long moment. He did not look away. That was one of the things she had never liked about Clyde, even when they were children. He had a way of telling you something shameful and then meeting your eye, as if daring you to be the one who flinched. She did not flinch. She had buried a husband and a father inside of 3 years, and she had nothing left in her that was afraid of Clyde Holloway. When, she said. End of the month, he said. That gives you 3 weeks. 3 weeks to pack up 60 years of my life. 3 weeks to pack up what belongs to you, he corrected. The furniture stays. Daddy bought most of it. The dishes stay. Those were Mama's, and Wendell's wife wants them. The quilts on the beds upstairs go with you, and whatever's in your old room, and anything you can show a receipt for. That's fair, Mags. That's more than fair. She did not argue. She had learned, in 72 years, that arguing with a man who has already decided is a way of handing him your dignity on a plate. She stood up, took her coffee cup off the counter, rinsed it in the sink, and set it upside down on the dish towel to dry. Then she walked out through the mudroom, past the row of her father's old barn coats still hanging on their pegs, past the boot tray where her own boots had sat for decades, and out into the gold September light. She drove the 3 miles of gravel road up to the old place without crying. That came later, in the truck, parked in the weeds of the overgrown driveway, looking up at the gray slumped shape of the house she had just inherited. She let herself cry for 7 minutes by the dashboard clock. Then she wiped her face with the heel of her hand and said out loud, to no one, "All right then. All right." She had said the same thing at Daniel's graveside. She had said it at her father's. She was beginning to understand that the phrase was the only prayer she still knew how to make. The first night she slept in the old place, she slept in the bed of her pickup under 2 wool blankets and her grandmother's quilt, because the floor of the house was not safe, and she had not yet figured out where in the kitchen the joists were solid enough to lay a cot. Shep, her border collie, slept pressed against her hip. He was 13 years old, mostly deaf, and his muzzle had gone entirely white, but his eyes were clear, and he had not left her side since Daniel died. He was, she thought sometimes, the last creature alive who remembered who she had been before the world started subtracting from her. She lay awake for a long time that first night, staring up at the stars through the open tailgate. The house loomed above the truck like a shipwreck in a dry sea. She could hear the tin of the roof ticking as it cooled. She could hear the rustle of something, probably a raccoon, inside the walls. She could hear, far off, the lowing of her father's cattle, which were now her brother's cattle, being driven into the near pasture for the night. It was the sound she had fallen asleep to every night of her childhood. Now it was the sound of something that was no longer hers. Before she finally slept, she did 2 things. First, she reached into the inside pocket of her barn coat and took out the small velvet box that held her wedding ring and Daniel's wedding ring, which she had worn on a chain around her neck for 3 years. She set the box on the dashboard where she could see it in the moonlight. Second, she said her husband's name out loud, just the once, the way she had done every night since the funeral. "Daniel," she said. Then she closed her eyes and let the old house watch over her. In the morning, she got up at 5:30 the way she had gotten up at 5:30 for 6 decades, and she set about the work of surviving. The first week in the old place was measured not in days, but in small decisions. Where to put the cot, where to set the camp stove, which corner of the kitchen floor would hold her weight, and which would drop her into the crawl space if she stepped wrong. She learned the house by walking it carefully, a hand always on the wall, Shep padding behind her with his nose working. The downstairs was 4 rooms, a kitchen, a parlor, a small bedroom that had been her great-grandmother's sewing room, and a pantry that opened onto a set of stairs leading down to a root cellar she did not yet have the courage to enter. The upstairs was worse. 2 of the 3 bedrooms had partial floor collapse, and the landing itself sagged so deeply that she could see daylight through the warped boards. A narrow staircase at the back of the upstairs hall led, theoretically, to the attic. But the door to that staircase had been nailed shut from the outside with 6 long, square-headed nails, the kind that had not been manufactured in 100 years. Maggie stood looking at that door for a long time on the 3rd day. Then she went back downstairs and did not think about it again for nearly a week. Her brothers did not come. She had not really expected them to. What she had not expected was how quickly the news traveled. On the 5th day, a woman from the Methodist church in town, Arlene Purvis, drove up the driveway in a dusty Buick and delivered a casserole and a look of such naked pity that Maggie felt her face go hot. "Oh, honey," Arlene said, standing in the weedy yard with the Pyrex dish in her hands. "We all heard what Clyde did. It's a shame. It's just a shame." And then, when Maggie did not answer, Arlene added, "You know, my sister-in-law works at Shady Grove, the assisted living out by Kearney. They've got a waiting list, but she could probably get you bumped up. You shouldn't be out here, sweetheart. Not at your age. Not in this." Maggie thanked her for the casserole and watched her drive away, and then stood in the yard for a long time with the Pyrex cooling in her hands. Assisted living. That was the word the town had already settled on for her. That was what Arlene Purvis and the rest of them were going to say at the diner, in the post office, and the church potluck for the next 6 months. That poor Maggie Holloway, living in that death trap up on the ridge. At her age. In the winter. Won't be long now. She walked inside, set the casserole on the camp stove, and said to Shep, "They've already buried me, old boy." Shep thumped his tail once against the linoleum. "All right then," she said. That was the day she started working. She worked the way her mother had taught her to work, which was not quickly, but unceasingly. She began with the kitchen because the kitchen was where she would live or die that winter. She pulled up the rotten boards one at a time and replaced them with plywood she bought from the lumber yard in Ord, paying cash out of the small checking account Daniel had left her. She sealed the broken windows with caulk and layered polyethylene. She got a small wood stove, secondhand, from a man in Burwell who sold it to her for $70 because his wife had died and he did not want it in the garage anymore. She installed a stovepipe herself, standing on a stepladder in the middle of the kitchen, because there was no one else to do it. It took her 3 days, and she cut her hand twice, and her hip ached so badly on the 2nd night that she wept in a Shep's fur, not from the pain, but from the simple, unbearable loneliness of being a 72-year-old woman installing a stovepipe alone in a house nobody thought she should be living in. But she finished it. And on the 4th night, she lit the first fire in the kitchen stove, and the house filled with the smell of wood smoke and dust burning off old iron, and she sat in a folding camp chair with Shep at her feet, and she ate a bowl of bean soup, and she thought, very clearly, all right, 1 room. I have 1 room. October came. The cottonwoods along the creek turned the color of old copper. The nights grew cold enough that she could see her breath in the kitchen before the stove caught. Clyde came up the driveway exactly once, in the first week of October, driving his big silver pickup, and he did not get out. He sat in the cab for a long time, looking at the house, and then he backed down the driveway and left. Maggie watched him from the kitchen window, without moving. She did not know what he had come for. She did not think he knew either. Wendell called her, on the phone she had bought herself at the Dollar General, a prepaid flip phone with $50 of minutes on it. He called on a Sunday afternoon. "Mags," he said. "It's Wendell. I know who it is. Clyde doesn't know I'm calling." "No, I suppose he wouldn't." There was a long silence on the line. Maggie could hear, in the background, the sound of Wendell's wife Dorothy vacuuming. Dorothy had always been loud about her cleaning, the way some women are loud about their Christianity. "How are you getting on up there?" Wendell said at last. "I'm getting on. Do you need anything?" Maggie considered the question. She considered the 63 years of weight behind it. She considered the way Wendell had sat at the kitchen table in September and stared at his knuckles. She considered, also, that he was still her brother, and that she had changed his diapers when she was 8 years old, and that there had been a summer when they were children, 1963 or 1964, when Wendell had followed her everywhere she went and called her Mags instead of Margaret, because he could not say his R's properly, and she had never corrected him and had loved him for it. "I'm getting on, Wendell," she said again. "Okay," he said. And then, after another long silence, "Mags, the old place. Has Clyde told you why Grandpa sealed it up?" She went very still. "What do you mean?" "Nothing. Never mind." "Wendell." "Nothing, Mags. I got to go. Dorothy's calling me." He hung up. Maggie stood in the kitchen with the cheap plastic phone in her hand and stared at the wall, where a faded rectangle of unpeeled paint showed where a calendar had hung in 1962, 63 years ago, the year her grandfather Thaddeus Holloway had walked out of the old place, locked the door behind him, and never come back. She had asked her father once, when she was a girl of 10, why Grandpa Thaddeus had moved down to the new house. Her father had given her a long look over the top of his coffee cup, and then he had said, "Margaret, your grandfather had his reasons, and your grandfather's reasons were his own business. You let that alone." She had let it alone. She had let it alone for 62 years. She did not let it alone anymore. That night, after she banked the stove and made sure Shep was settled on the quilt beside her cot, Maggie took the small flashlight she kept by the bed, and she climbed the creaking stairs to the upstairs landing. She walked past the collapsed bedroom on the left and the collapsed bedroom on the right, and she stood in front of the narrow door at the back of the hall, the door with the 6 long, square-headed nails driven through it into the frame. She ran her fingers over the heads of the nails. They were rough with rust and old paint and 63 years of winters. "What did you seal up here, Grandpa?" she whispered. The house did not answer, but somewhere inside the walls, the wind moved, and the old boards shifted, and Maggie heard, very faintly, a sound that she could not quite identify. It might have been a draft. It might have been the house breathing. It might have been nothing at all. She went back downstairs and lay awake until dawn, thinking. The first snow came on the 10th of November, a week earlier than Maggie would have liked. She had not finished caulking the parlor windows. She had not gotten the chimney properly cleaned. She had not laid in as much firewood as she needed for a full Nebraska winter, and she knew it. She stood at the kitchen window watching the flakes come down thick and soft and gray against the dead grass of the yard, and she thought about all the things that were not ready, and then she thought about her mother, who had once told her that a woman who waited until she was ready would be waiting until she was dead. So she put on her barn coat and her gloves, and she went out and split wood for 4 hours in the falling snow, and by the time the light went blue at the end of the afternoon, she had another half-cord stacked against the side of the house. That was the night she heard the noise in the attic for the first time. She had banked the stove and gotten into her cot, and was just drifting off, Shep curled heavy against her legs, when a sound came down through the ceiling. A slow, deliberate thump. Then silence. Then another thump. Shep lifted his head. His ears, which were mostly deaf to the outside world, were still sharp for anything inside the house. He stared up at the ceiling, and the scruff of his neck rose. Maggie lay very still. She counted in her head. The thumps came in twos, always two, separated by long silences. 1, 2, silence. 1, 2, silence. It was not a raccoon. Raccoons did not thump in twos. Raccoons scrabbled and ran. She thought about going upstairs. She thought about the flashlight by the bed. She thought about the sealed door at the back of the upstairs hall and the 6 long, square-headed nails. She thought about her age and her hip and the fact that she was a widow alone in a falling-down house with only a mostly deaf dog for company, and that there would be no one coming up the driveway to help her, not Clyde, not Wendell, not Arlene Purvis, not anyone. She thought, also, about what Wendell had almost said on the phone. "Has Clyde told you why Grandpa sealed it up?" The thump stopped. The house settled. Shep lowered his head back onto his paws, though his eyes stayed open for a long time. Maggie did not sleep. She lay on her back in the cot and watched the shadows the stove made on the ceiling, and she listened to the wind pick up outside, and somewhere in the long second half of that first snowy night, she made a decision. She made it quietly, the way she made all her important decisions, without drama, without announcement, without any witness but Shep and the ticking of the cooling stovepipe. She was going to open the sealed door. Not that week. Not even that month, maybe. She was going to be careful, and she was going to be patient, and she was going to find out first what her grandfather had been afraid of before she went up those stairs with a crowbar. But she was going to open it. Because she was 72 years old and her brothers had taken everything that anyone could see and had left her with only the thing that no one had bothered to look at. And if there was one lesson her 72 years had taught her, it was this. The things nobody bothered to look at were usually the things that mattered most. She turned her head on the pillow and looked at the velvet box on the little crate beside her cot, the box that held her wedding ring and Daniel's. In the orange light from the stove's grate, the velvet looked almost black. "All right, Daniel," she whispered. "All right then. Outside, the snow kept falling on the old house, and on the sealed attic, and on the long gravel road that no one was driving up, and on the ridge where 6 generations of Holloways had lived and died, and on the new house down in the flat where her brothers slept warm under her mother's quilts, and had no idea at all, what their sister was beginning to understand. The thing about living alone in an old house through the beginning of a Nebraska winter is that the house becomes, whether you want it to or not, a second body. You learn its aches. You learn which joist groans when the temperature drops below 20, and which window frame rattles when the wind comes out of the northwest, and which floorboard in the hallway pops when you step on it wrong. After 3 weeks of listening, Maggie knew the old place the way she had once known Daniel's breathing in the dark. And that was how she knew, with a certainty she could not have explained to another living soul, that the thumps she had heard on the night of the first snow had not been the house. She did not go up to the attic door right away. She had made a decision, and she was going to honor it. But she was also 72 years old, and she had not survived 72 years by walking into rooms she did not understand. So she began, instead, with the papers. Her father had kept everything. It was one of the small tragedies of having a careful man for a parent. When he died, he left behind not just grief, but also 47 cardboard boxes of receipts, canceled checks, tax returns, and farm records going back to 1952. Clyde had taken the recent records, the ones that mattered for the operation, the ones that showed what the farm was currently worth. But Clyde had not bothered with the old boxes. The old boxes had been shoved into the second bedroom of the old place decades ago, back when the upstairs floor had still been sound enough to walk on, and they had sat there ever since, slowly being consumed by mice and damp. When Maggie had moved in, she had stacked them in the corner of the kitchen to keep them away from the holes in the floor. She had not yet had the heart to look through them. Now she did. She started on a Wednesday afternoon, after she had swept the kitchen and fed Shep and banked the stove for the day. The snow had stopped, but the sky outside the window was that low iron gray that meant more was coming. She dragged the first box over to the kitchen table and lifted the flaps. What she found was her life. Her whole life, in chronological order, filed by a man who had never once told her he loved her, but who had kept every report card she had ever brought home, every letter she had written from college, every thank you note she had mailed after her wedding. She had to stop twice in the first hour to cry. Shep pressed his head against her knee and waited patiently for her to begin again. But she was not looking for her life. She was looking for her grandfather. Thaddeus Holloway had been born in 1894, in the same house Maggie was now living in. He had fought in the First World War, come home, married a woman named Etta Rasmussen from a Danish family 2 counties over, and taken over the farm from his own father in 1923. He had raised 3 sons, of whom Maggie's father, Orville, had been the oldest. He had buried Etta in 1958. He had sealed the old place and moved to the new house down in the flat in 1962. He had died in 1971, when Maggie was 19 years old and in her first year at the community college in Grand Island, studying to be a bookkeeper, which she had never become. She remembered Grandpa Thaddeus vaguely, a tall, stooped man with yellow-white hair and hands that were always cold, who spoke so rarely that when he did speak, the whole family went quiet to listen. He had loved her. She had known, even as a child, that he had loved her. But he had also frightened her, in a way she could not name, and she had never been sorry to leave his company. By the second afternoon, she had found the first interesting thing. It was a letter, dated August 12, 1962, written in her grandmother Etta's handwriting. But Etta had died in 1958, so it was not Etta who had written the letter. It was Thaddeus, writing in his dead wife's hand. Dearest Etta, the letter began. Today I did what we talked about. I nailed the door. I did not use the padlock, because a padlock can be cut, and a padlock invites the question. 6 square nails, the old kind, from the keg in the granary. I used the horse's hammer. I think she would have liked that I used the horse's hammer for this, after everything. I will not write to you about what is behind the door. You know. You are the only one who knew, and now that you are gone, I am the only one who knows, and when I am gone, there will be no one. That is how it should be. I am sorry, Etta. I am sorry for all of it. I am sorry most of all that you love me anyway. Your Thad. Maggie sat at the kitchen table with the letter in her lap for a long time. The light outside the window went from iron to slate to dark. Shep dozed at her feet. The fire in the stove burned down, and she did not get up to feed it, and the kitchen grew cold, and still she sat, reading the letter over and over again. I will not write to you about what is behind the door. She went through every box after that. It took her 9 more days. She did not find another letter, but she found other things. She found a property survey from 1934, drawn by a county surveyor named Albert Voss, with a neat hand-lettered note in the margin. Per Mr. Holloway's instruction, the north parcel is not to be included in any future division. She found a receipt from 1957 from a firm in Omaha called Hagen & Sons for the sum of $312 for services described only as consultation, itemization, secure storage preparation. She found a photograph, black and white, of her grandfather standing in front of the old place in what must have been 1961 or 1962, holding a long, narrow wooden box in his arms the way a man holds a sleeping child. She could not tell from the photograph what was in the box. His face was turned down toward it, and his expression, even in the grainy old image, was the expression of a man looking at something he both loved and feared. And she found, folded into the back of a 1968 tax return, a small yellowed envelope with her own name written on the front in her grandfather's spidery handwriting. Margaret. The envelope had never been opened. It had sat in a tax return for 57 years, waiting. Inside was a single sheet of paper, and on the paper, in the same spidery hand, were 11 words. When you are ready, the key is in the clock. Forgive me. T. Maggie read the note 3 times. Then she stood up, very slowly, favoring her hip, and she walked into the parlor. The parlor of the old place was the one room Maggie had not touched since she moved in. It was too cold to be worth heating, the floorboards were questionable, and it was crowded with old furniture under sheets, furniture that had belonged to her grandparents and had been left behind when Thaddeus moved to the new house in 1962. Maggie had walked through it once with a flashlight on her first day and then closed the door. Now she opened the door again, and she shone her flashlight slowly across the shrouded shapes of the room, and there, in the far corner, against the east wall, stood a tall, narrow grandfather clock. She had forgotten about the clock. She had not thought about it in 50 years. But as soon as she saw it, she remembered. Her grandmother Etta had stood in front of this clock once, winding it, when Maggie was very small, perhaps 4 years old, and had said to her, in a voice Maggie had never forgotten, "This clock belongs to the house, little one. It does not belong to any person. It belongs to the house." Maggie crossed the parlor carefully, testing each floorboard. She reached the clock and pulled the sheet off. The clock was taller than she was. It was made of dark walnut, the case carved in a simple, austere pattern. The face had stopped at 6:17, which, she realized after a moment, must have been the time Thaddeus had stopped winding it, sometime in the summer of 1962. The glass of the case was intact. The brass pendulum hung motionless behind it. She did not know where, in a grandfather clock, one would hide a key. She opened the long case door and looked inside. The pendulum, the weights, dust. She ran her fingers along the inside of the case and found nothing. She looked at the top of the case, above the face. The hood was a separate piece, carved with a little crown of wooden finials. She reached up and tried to lift it, but her hands were not strong enough, and her hip was hurting, and she had to stop. She went back to the kitchen and made herself a cup of coffee and sat down. Shep put his chin on her knee. "Patience, old boy," she said. "Patience." She waited 2 days before trying the clock again. She did it because she wanted to be calm when she opened it, and she did not think she would be calm if she rushed. She fed herself properly. She slept as well as she could. She split more wood. And on the morning of the 3rd day, she walked into the parlor with a small step stool and a flathead screwdriver, and she lifted the hood of the clock off its pegs. It came free with a small dry click. Inside the crown of the clock, sitting on a little wooden shelf that had been built into the space above the face, was a brown canvas pouch tied with a leather string. Maggie's hands were shaking so badly, she almost dropped the step stool climbing down. She carried the pouch to the kitchen table. She sat down. She untied the leather string. She turned the pouch upside down. 3 things fell out onto the oilcloth. The first was a key. It was made of iron, dark with age, about 4 inches long, with a square shank and teeth cut in a pattern she had never seen before. It was heavy. It looked like something from a museum. The second was a small flat tin, about the size of a playing card, with the word poison stamped on the lid in faded red paint. When Maggie opened it, she found it empty except for a folded slip of paper. On the paper, in her grandfather's hand, was a drawing. It was a drawing of the upstairs of the old place. The two collapsed bedrooms were marked with excess. The sealed attic door at the back of the hall was drawn carefully and labeled not attic. And behind the wall of the sealed staircase, in the space that Maggie had always assumed was just empty framing, there was a second room drawn in. It was labeled, in her grandfather's handwriting, Eda's room. The third thing was another letter. This one was much shorter than the first. Margaret, the letter read, "The door with the nails is a false door. Anyone who breaks through it will find only a staircase going up to an attic with a broken window and 40 years of pigeon droppings. That is what I wanted any curious person to find. The true room is behind the east wall of that staircase. You will find a panel of wainscoting that is not nailed. It swings inward. The key fits the lock behind the panel. Eda wanted you to have what is in that room, but she died before we could agree on when. I am leaving it to you to decide when you are ready. Be gentle with what you find. It will not make you rich in the way the world measures. It will make you rich in the way that matters. I love you, child. I should have told you more often. Grandpa." Maggie sat at the kitchen table with the key in one hand and the letter in the other, and she cried for a long time. Not the way she had cried on the first day, parked in the driveway. This was a different crying. This was the crying of a woman who had just learned, after 7 decades of believing otherwise, that she had been loved by someone she had not known loved her. It was the crying of a woman who was beginning to understand that the man everyone had called paranoid had not been paranoid at all. He had been waiting. He had been waiting for her. She did not go up to the attic door that night. She put the key and the letters and the little tin back in the canvas pouch, and she hid the pouch inside the lining of Daniel's old wool hunting jacket, which hung on a nail by the kitchen door, because she had decided that anything worth hiding was worth hiding well. Then she made herself a supper of soup and bread, and she fed Shep, and she went to bed early, and she slept for 10 hours without waking. In the morning, she began to plan. She did not trust her own strength for what was coming. Her hip was bad, and her hands were not as strong as they had once been, and the upstairs floor was not safe. She spent most of the next week shoring up the floor of the upstairs hallway, nailing new plywood over the worst of the sagging boards, working a little at a time so as not to hurt herself. She had Shep lie at the bottom of the stairs and bark if he heard anything outside, which he did twice, both times because a deer had wandered into the yard. She kept the flip phone in her pocket. She did not tell anyone what she had found. Not Wendell. Not Arlene Purvis, who came back with a second casserole and a brochure from Shady Grove that Maggie accepted politely and burned in the stove the moment the Buick disappeared down the driveway. On the second Tuesday in December, with the wind coming hard out of the north and the temperature holding at 18 degrees, Maggie climbed the stairs of the old place with a crowbar in one hand and the iron key in her coat pocket and Shep panting at her heels. She did not go to the nailed door. The nailed door was a decoy. She had read her grandfather's instructions carefully, and she trusted him now, this man she had barely known, in a way she had not trusted anyone in a long time. She went instead to the east wall of the short hallway, the wall to the right of the nailed door, and she ran her fingers along the wainscoting panel by panel. The panels were all nailed. Every single one. She checked again. She got down on her knees, her hips shrieking, and she pressed each panel with her palm, and she tapped each one with the handle of the crowbar, and every single panel was solid and nailed and behaved exactly the way a wainscoting panel should behave. She sat back on her heels and she said, quietly, "Grandpa, you did not." For a long, terrible moment, she thought she had misread the letter. She thought she had come up the stairs for nothing. She thought the whole thing, the clock, the key, the drawing, had been the elaborate joke of a dying man, or worse, the confusion of a mind that had been failing for longer than anyone had known. Then Shep, sitting beside her in the hallway, lifted one paw and scratched at the baseboard, the way a dog scratches at a door he wants opened. Maggie looked down at him. He scratched again. He was scratching not at a wainscoting panel, but at the baseboard below it. She bent over and looked closely, and there, where the baseboard met the floor, she saw something she had missed. A faint vertical seam, not in the wainscoting above, but in the baseboard itself. She pressed it with her thumb. The baseboard moved. Not much. just a quarter of an inch. But it moved. She worked the crowbar into the seam, gently, and she pried. The baseboard came away in her hand, a single foot-long section of it, cleanly and without splintering, because it had been designed to come away. Behind the baseboard was a small iron lever, set flush into the wall, the kind of lever a person might use to open a hidden cupboard. Maggie pulled the lever. Somewhere inside the wall, a latch released with a small dry sound, and the entire wainscoting panel directly above her, the one she had been tapping and testing, swung inward on hinges she had not been able to see, revealing a narrow, dark opening the size of a doorway. A breath of cold, dry air came out of the opening. It smelled of dust and cedar and something else, something faintly metallic, like old coins. Shep whined once and backed up a step. Maggie picked up her flashlight with a hand that had gone numb, and she got to her feet, and she stood in front of the opening for a long time, long enough for her breathing to steady. Then she clicked on the flashlight, and she shone it into the dark. The beam showed a short passage, 3 feet wide and maybe 4 feet long, ending at a second door. This door was not nailed. It was not wood. It was made of iron, banded across the middle, set into a frame of cut stone that seemed to have been built directly into the wall of the old house. It had a single keyhole. The lock was the size of her fist. Maggie stepped into the passage. The floor was solid beneath her feet, reinforced with something heavier than ordinary joists, something she could feel even through the soles of her boots. She reached the iron door. She took the key out of her coat pocket. Her hand was shaking so badly, she had to use both hands to fit the key into the lock. It slid in as if it had been greased yesterday. She turned it. There was a deep, heavy, satisfying sound from inside the door, the sound of a mechanism that had been waiting 63 years to do exactly this, and the door released with a soft breath of escaping air. Maggie pushed it open. The room on the other side was small, no larger than a pantry. The walls and floor and ceiling were all made of the same cut stone, fitted so carefully that she could barely see the seams. There was no dust. That was the first thing she noticed. The room had been sealed so perfectly that in 63 years, no dust had settled. The air was cool and dry, and it carried that faint metallic smell she had caught from the passage, only stronger now. She stood in the doorway, holding the flashlight in front of her, and she let the beam travel slowly across the room, and she saw what her grandfather had left for her. Against the far wall stood a small wooden desk of the sort a country doctor might have used in 1910, with a single drawer and a pen rest. On the desk, arranged neatly, were 3 leather-bound books, a tin of pens, and a framed photograph of her grandmother Etta as a young woman. Against the left wall stood a bank of 12 narrow wooden drawers, the kind used to store maps or flat documents, each drawer labeled in her grandfather's handwriting with a year: 1923, 1931, 1937, 1945, 1952, 1958. Against the right wall stood a safe. It was not large. It was perhaps the size of a small refrigerator, made of dark green steel, with a combination dial and a brass handle, and on the front of the safe, stenciled in white paint, were the initials T.H. And on the floor in the middle of the room, set upon a small woven rug, were 3 long narrow wooden boxes, the same kind of boxes her grandfather had been holding in the photograph from 1961. Maggie took one step into the room, then another. She set the flashlight down on the little desk so that it lit the ceiling and filled the whole space with a soft reflected light. She walked to the boxes. She knelt beside them, slowly, her hip complaining the whole way down, and she opened the lid of the first one. She did not cry this time. She was beyond crying. She just looked. She looked for a long time. Behind her, in the doorway, Shep sat down on his haunches and watched his mistress in the lit stone room, and he did not make a sound, because even a mostly deaf old dog knew, in the deep animal part of him, that something had just changed forever. Inside the first wooden box, laid on a bed of old velvet that had once been dark blue and had now gone the soft gray of a mourning dove, was a long rifle. Maggie was not a woman who knew rifles, but she had been raised on a Nebraska farm, and she knew enough to know that this was not an ordinary gun. The stock was carved of a pale honey-colored which she did not recognize. The metal of the barrel was inlaid with a thin line of silver that ran the whole length of it, and at the breech, engraved into the steel in letters so fine she had to lean close to read them, was a German word she could not pronounce and a date, 1854. Tucked beside the rifle was a smaller velvet pouch, and when she opened it, she found a brass plate engraved with the name of a town in Saxony and the words presentation piece, and, in English underneath, to Colonel Rasmussen, on the occasion of his retirement. Rasmussen, her grandmother's maiden name. This had been Etta's great-grandfather's gun, carried across the Atlantic in 1887 and put into a wooden box and hidden in a stone room on a Nebraska ridge for reasons Maggie was only beginning to understand. She closed the box gently. She did not touch the rifle. She had the strong sense, kneeling there on the rug in the lit stone room, that she was in the presence of things that did not belong to her yet, that would not belong to her until she had earned the right to handle them, and that earning the right would begin with being careful. The second box held coins. Not many. 40, perhaps 50. They were wrapped individually in small squares of waxed paper, and when she unwrapped the first one, it was heavier than a coin should be, and gold, and old, with the profile of a man in a laurel crown on one side and letters she could not read on the other. She unwrapped 3 more, and they were all different, from different centuries, some silver, some gold, one so old that the edges were worn almost smooth. She wrapped them all up again and closed the box. The third box was the smallest and the lightest. When she opened it, she found papers, deeds. She pulled the top one out and unfolded it on the rug, and she read it twice. And then she sat back on her heels and she said, out loud, to Shep and to the stone walls and to the ghost of her grandfather Thaddeus who had left this room for her. Oh my. The deed on the top of the stack was the original grant deed to the Holloway farm. Not the working farm her brothers had taken. The whole section, 640 acres, recorded in 1887, patented under the Homestead Act to one Nils Thaddeus Holloway, her great-grandfather. And below the original deed were the division papers, drawn up in 1923, when her grandfather Thaddeus had inherited the land from his own father. And below those were the partition records of 1956, when her grandfather had formally separated the north parcel, the one with the old place on it, from the rest of the operation. And every one of those documents was stamped and notarized and filed. Every one of them was legal. Every one of them made clear, in the kind of dry, precise language that only a mid-century county recorder could produce, that the north parcel, including the ridge, including the old place, including 211 acres of land, had been legally separated from the working farm in 1956 and placed into a trust in the name of Etta Rasmussen Holloway. And when Etta had died in 1958, the trust had passed, by the terms of her will, not to her husband Thaddeus and not to their sons, but to a future beneficiary, to be named, by the keyholder. Maggie looked at the iron key in her hand. She looked at the papers on the rug. She understood, slowly, the way a person understands a language they have not spoken since childhood, what her grandmother and her grandfather had done. They had set aside a portion of the land. They had made it unreachable by anyone who did not have the key, and they had given the key to her. She turned to the next paper in the stack, and the next, and the next. There were titles she did not at first understand. There was a document from a bank in Omaha dated 1961, referring to a safe deposit box held jointly in the names of Thaddeus and Etta Holloway, and a note clipped to it in her grandfather's handwriting. Contents moved to secure storage 1962, box closed. There was a letter from a lawyer in Lincoln, dated 1969, acknowledging the receipt of certain items for appraisal and enclosing a list. She read the list. Her hands, by this point, had stopped shaking and had gone entirely still, the way her mother's hands used to go still when she was doing something that required absolute concentration, like threading a sewing machine. The list was 3 pages long. It was arranged alphabetically, and it was, she slowly realized, an inventory of everything in the room around her, plus everything in the safe she had not yet opened, plus several items described only by catalog number and a cryptic phrase. Rasmussen Collection, items 1 through 14, estate provenance documented. She did not open the safe that day. She did not have the combination, for one thing. And for another, she had reached the limit of what a 72-year-old woman with a bad hip could process in a single afternoon. She gathered the papers carefully back into the third box. She took the top deed and the lawyer's inventory with her, and she closed the iron door behind her, and she locked it, and she pressed the wainscoting panel back into place, and she replaced the section of baseboard, and she carried the papers down the stairs and put them inside the lining of Daniel's hunting jacket, next to the canvas pouch with the key. Then she sat at the kitchen table for a long time, and she thought about what she was going to do. She did not call a lawyer in Grand Island, because Grand Island was where Clyde's lawyer was, and she did not know whose pocket ran how deep in a town that small. She did not call the bank in Ord, for the same reason. She thought about it for 2 days. On the third day, she remembered a name she had not thought of in 40 years. Her husband Daniel had had a cousin, a woman named Ruth Swenson, who had gone to law school late in life and had set up a small practice in Lincoln specializing in estate matters. Ruth would be in her late 60s now. Maggie had not spoken to her since Daniel's funeral. But Ruth had been kind at the funeral, in a quiet, plain way that Maggie had not forgotten. And Ruth was 140 miles away, and Ruth did not know Clyde Holloway from Adam. Maggie drove to the truck stop outside Ord, because the reception there was better than at the old place, and she called information, and she got the number, and she called Ruth Swenson, and she said, "Ruth, this is Margaret Holloway, Daniel's widow. I need a lawyer, and I think I need one who knows me a little." Ruth did not ask a single question for 2 full minutes. She just listened while Maggie described what she had found. Then, in a voice that was as plain and kind as Maggie had remembered, Ruth said, "Margaret, do not tell another living soul what you just told me. Do not tell your brothers. Do not tell the neighbors. Do not tell the minister. Do not take those papers out of the house. I am driving up tomorrow." Ruth arrived the next afternoon in a mud-splattered Subaru with a briefcase and a thermos of coffee and a small, sharp-eyed look that Maggie recognized as the look of a woman who had been underestimated her entire life and had come to enjoy the advantage of it. They sat at the kitchen table for 6 hours. Ruth read every document twice. She made phone calls, stepping outside into the cold yard, speaking quietly into her cell phone. She opened the safe, because she knew how to listen to the tumblers, a trick she had picked up from an old estate client. And when the safe swung open, they both stood looking into it for a long time without speaking, because what was inside was not just money, though there was money. There were bearer bonds from the 1960s. There were stock certificates in companies that had been bought and split and bought again. Companies Maggie had heard of on the evening news all her life, without ever realizing her grandmother's maiden family had owned pieces of them from the beginning. There were 2 small leather-bound ledgers that traced the holdings from 1924 to 1971. There was a third ledger, in a different hand, a woman's hand, her grandmother's hand, that tracked the same holdings from 1945 to 1958. Ruth closed the safe. She looked at Maggie across the kitchen table. "Margaret," she said, "I need to be very careful about how I say this. Your grandfather and your grandmother did not leave you a shack on a ridge. They left you a fortune. I cannot tell you the exact number tonight. I am going to need appraisers and a forensic accountant and a historian for the Rasmussen pieces. But I can tell you this. It is not under $1 million. It is not under 10. I believe, just from what I have seen this afternoon, that the total value, counting the land, the collectibles, the securities, and the Rasmussen provenance items, is somewhere between $28 and $36 million. Maggie did not react. She had used up her capacity for reaction. She simply asked, "And the land? The working land? That my brothers took?" Ruth took a long, slow breath. "Margaret, that is the other thing. I am going to need to pull the full chain of title at the courthouse tomorrow. But from what I am reading in these 1956 partition papers, your grandfather did not partition the north parcel out of the larger farm. He partitioned the larger farm out of the north parcel. The north parcel, the one you are currently sitting on, is the parent tract. The 460 acres of working farm your brothers are operating are a carve-out from it. And if the original trust instrument was never formally dissolved, which I am beginning to suspect it was not, then your brothers are not the owners of that land. They are tenants, and the landlord is the trust, and the beneficiary of the trust is you." Maggie looked at her hands on the kitchen table. "I need to be sure," Ruth said quickly. "I need to pull everything. I need to see your father's will, the one your brother used, and I need to see it against the actual title records, not just what he told you it said. Do not do anything yet. Do not call them. Do not say a word. Give me 3 weeks." Maggie nodded slowly. Ruth drove back to Lincoln that night. 3 weeks became 4. 4 became 6. Christmas came and went. Maggie spent it alone in the old place with Shep, a small tree she had cut herself from the woodlot, and a roast chicken. Wendell sent her a Christmas card with $20 in it and a note that read only, "Mags, thinking of you." She put the card on the kitchen windowsill. She did not spend the $20. In the second week of January, Ruth Swenson called and said, "Margaret, I need you to come to Lincoln. I have 3 people I want you to meet. And I have the answer." Maggie drove down the next morning. The drive took 4 hours. She sat in a conference room in a quiet old office building on O Street, and Ruth introduced her to a silver-haired man from the State Historical Society, a woman from an auction house in Chicago, and a second lawyer, a younger woman, whose specialty was what she called trust revivification. They each spoke in turn. Maggie listened. She took notes in a small spiral notebook, the way she had taken notes in her bookkeeping classes half a century ago. The rifle was real. The silver-haired man confirmed it. It was one of perhaps 6 known presentation pieces from that particular Saxon arsenal, and the last one that had come up at auction had sold, in 2019, for $480,000. The coins were real. The woman from the auction house had photographed them and sent the photographs to a specialist in New York. The collection, taken together, was conservatively worth $2.2 million, with several individual pieces likely to exceed $250,000 each. The securities in the safe, when updated for 60-plus years of splits and dividends and reinvestments, came to a present value that made Maggie stop writing in her notebook and set the pen down very carefully. And the land. The younger lawyer spoke about the land. The 1956 trust had never been dissolved. Maggie's father Orville had either not known it existed, which Ruth and the younger lawyer both considered unlikely, or had simply chosen not to mention it, and had written his own will as if the entire 640-acre original tract had been his to dispose of. Clyde had taken that will to a probate court that had not done a deep title search, because nobody does a deep title search on a farm that has been in the same family for 140 years. The probate had gone through. The deeds had been recorded. And every one of those recorded deeds was, the younger lawyer said, void on its face. Not contestable. Void. The land had never left the trust. The cattle and the equipment, by the logic of what had been purchased with income off the land, were at a minimum subject to a complicated accounting that Maggie's brothers were very unlikely to win. "What does that mean in practice?" Maggie asked. Ruth said, "It means that as of the moment I file the papers, which I would like to file on Friday, your brothers own nothing that they think they own. The land reverts to the trust. The trust names you as the beneficiary. You will be, by the end of the month, the legal owner of record of the entire Holloway farm, plus the homestead, plus the contents of the stone room, plus the securities. And you will have the option, if you choose, to pursue restitution from your brothers for the income they have drawn off the land since your father's death." Maggie sat for a long moment looking at her hands. Then she said, "File it on Friday. But I do not want restitution. I want the land back. I want the old place in my name clean. I want the contents of the stone room appraised and insured. And then I want to decide, when I am ready, what happens next." Ruth nodded. The younger lawyer made a note. The woman from the auction house said she would send appraisers within the week. The silver-haired man from the Historical Society asked, very quietly, if the Rasmussen rifle might, at some future point, be considered for loan to the State Museum. Maggie said she would think about it. She liked the idea. She thought her grandmother would have liked the idea too. She drove home that night through a soft snow, and for the first time in 6 months, she did not feel old. Ruth filed the papers on Friday. The deeds hit the county recorder's office in Grand Island on Monday morning. By Monday afternoon, Clyde Holloway had been called by his banker, who had been called by the county clerk, and Clyde had driven out to his own farmhouse. The one he had told Maggie was the operations headquarters, and he had sat down at the kitchen table, and he had read the notice of trust revivification twice. And then he had called his lawyer, and his lawyer had told him, very carefully, that there was nothing to be done. It was Wendell who drove up the ridge. Maggie had expected Clyde, but it was Wendell, alone, in his old blue Chevy, creeping up the icy gravel road on a Tuesday afternoon in late January. She watched him from the kitchen window. She did not go out to meet him. She let him come to the door and knock, which he did, 3 times, softly. She opened the door. He stood on the porch with his cap in his hands. His hair had gone whiter in the months since she had seen him, and his shoulders had gone narrower, and he looked, suddenly, like their father in the last year of his life. "Mags," he said. "Wendell, can I come in?" "You can come in." She made him coffee. She did not offer him a chair, but he took one anyway, the folding camp chair by the stove, and he sat with his cap in his hands and looked at the floor for a long time before he spoke. "I should have told you," he said. "Told me what?" "Grandpa told me. Before he died. He told me there was a room up here. He told me Grandma had left something for her. For you. For whoever the key holder was." I was 19 years old, Mags. I did not understand what he was saying. And then Daddy told me, later, after Grandpa was gone, that Grandpa had been losing his mind at the end, and that there was no room and no treasure, and that I should not mention it to anyone, especially not to you, because you had just started at the community college and Daddy did not want you filling your head up with old family nonsense. And I believed him, Mags. I believed Daddy. I am sorry. I have been sorry for a long time, but I did not know how sorry until last Monday. Maggie poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down on her cot, because there was only the one chair. Did Clyde know? Clyde knew what Daddy told him. Same as me. But Clyde never believed it was nonsense. Clyde thought Daddy was hiding it from us. Clyde has been looking for that room for 30 years, Max. He tore up the floors in the new house twice, back when Daddy was still alive. He used to come up here and walk the property line and look at the old place and say there had to be something. When Daddy died, Clyde thought the working farm was the consolation prize. He thought whatever Grandpa had hidden was already lost, or in a bank box somewhere nobody could find it. He wrote you off, Mags. He wrote you off because he thought there was nothing left to fight over up here. Maggie sat very still. And you? Wendell looked up at her. His eyes were wet. I let him. I let him because I was tired, Mags. I was tired of being the one who nodded. I was tired my whole life. And now I am 70 years old, and I am losing the farm I helped my daddy build, and I deserve to lose it. And I am sitting in my sister's kitchen trying to figure out how to say I am sorry, and there are no words for it. There are no words. Maggie looked at him for a long time. Outside, the wind moved across the ridge, and Shep, lying on the rag rug by the stove, shifted in his sleep. I am not going to take the working farm from you, she said finally. Wendell stopped breathing. I am going to take it back into the trust, which is where it belongs. And I am going to lease it to you. You and Clyde both. At a fair rate. You can keep farming it for as long as you want to farm it, and when you are done, it comes back to me, and I decide what to do with it. Your equipment is yours. Your cattle are yours. Your houses are yours. What is mine is the land, and what the land produces belongs to the trust, minus a fair tenant's share to you. Ruth will draw up the papers. Wendell put his face in his hands. I am not doing it because I forgive you yet, Maggie said. I am not sure I do. I am doing it because I am 72 years old, and I have already spent too much of my life being what other people decided I was, and I do not want to spend what is left being the kind of woman who breaks her brothers in the winter of their lives. That is not who Mama raised. That is not who Grandma Etta left this to. That is not who I am. Wendell wept into his hands without making a sound. After a while he got up, and he set his cap on his head, and he went to the door. He stopped with his hand on the knob. Mags. Yes. Clyde is going to be harder. He is going to be much harder. He may never come up that road. I know. I will tell him what you said. You tell him what you need to tell him. Wendell nodded. He opened the door. He paused one more time. Mama would be proud of you. Mama would be proud of both of us. Wendell, if we let her. He closed the door softly behind him. Clyde never did come up the ridge. He wrote her one letter, in April, in a handwriting that had gone shaky, and the letter was not an apology. The letter was a list of grievances and a demand that she consider a lower rental rate than the one Ruth had proposed. Maggie read the letter once and filed it in a folder she labeled Clyde and did not answer it. 3 months later, Clyde suffered a small stroke and was moved, by his own children, into the assisted living facility outside Kearney, the same shady grove that Arlene Purvis had once recommended for Maggie. Maggie did not go to see him. She sent him a fruit basket at Christmas and a card that read only, "Thinking of you, Margaret." She did not hear back. She had not expected to. The spring that Maggie turned 73, she had the old place restored. Not gutted. Not modernized. Restored, the way a museum restores a thing, with the help of a young architect from Lincoln who specialized in prairie farmsteads and who wept openly the first time Maggie showed him the stone room. The floors were rebuilt with timber milled from fallen trees on the property. The windows were reglazed. The roof was shingled in proper cedar. The sealed attic, the false one, was turned into a reading room with a window facing east. And the stone room was left exactly as Thaddeus had left it, its iron door kept unlocked now, its contents cataloged and insured and mostly loaned out. The Rasmussen rifle on permanent display at the State Museum in Lincoln, the coins at a traveling exhibit that moved through 4 Midwestern cities that summer. Maggie kept only the 3 leather-bound books from the little desk, the framed photograph of Etta, and one of the smaller gold coins, which she wore sometimes on a chain around her neck, along with her wedding ring. She did not move into the new house down in the flat, the house Clyde had once called the operations headquarters, though Wendell told her several times it was hers now and she should take it. She stayed on the ridge. She rebuilt the porch where the front steps had been. She planted a small orchard where the weeds had been. She put in a proper well. She got a second dog, a young Australian shepherd named June, who became Shep's last and most patient companion, until Shep finally lay down one afternoon in the sun on the new porch and did not get up again, in the October of Maggie's 74th year. She buried him herself, with Wendell's help, at the edge of the orchard, under a flat stone she had carved with his name. She gave a great deal of money away. Not all of it. She was a careful woman, and she wanted to leave Wendell's grandchildren something, and Clyde's grandchildren too, because the children had not chosen their fathers. But she gave. She funded the rebuilding of the Methodist church in town, which needed a new roof. She established a scholarship at the community college in Grand Island, in bookkeeping, the degree she had never finished. She paid off the medical debts of 19 families in the county, chosen by her pastor and a social worker from the county office, without ever being named as the donor. Arlene Purvis came up the driveway twice more, in those years, each time with a casserole and no brochure. And on the second visit, she sat at Maggie's kitchen table and cried and apologized for what she had said, and Maggie poured her another cup of coffee and told her not to worry about it, because Arlene had only said out loud what the rest of the town had been thinking, and Maggie was past needing apologies from people who had simply been wrong. And every evening, when the light went gold across the ridge, Maggie walked up the stairs of the old place, the stairs she had rebuilt with her own money, and she stood in front of the iron door at the back of the upstairs hall, and she looked at it. She did not always open it. Sometimes she just stood. She had taken to calling it, privately, not the sealed room, because it was no longer sealed, but the gate. Her grandfather's gate. Her grandmother's gate. Hers now. What she thought about, standing there, was how much of a life is spent behind doors that other people have told you not to open. How many rooms in a woman's own house she never walks into because somewhere, decades ago, someone decided for her that the room was empty, or dangerous, or nonsense, or not her concern. She thought about how her father had told Wendell the room did not exist. She thought about how Arlene Purvis had told her she belonged at Shady Grove. She thought about how Clyde had told her, at the kitchen table on a Tuesday in September, that the old place was a gift. And she thought about how long it had taken her, how many decades it had taken her, to understand that the only gift that mattered in the end was the gift of being the one who decides when a door gets opened. She was 72 when she opened the gate. She lived to be 89. In those 17 years, she opened a great many other doors, in herself and in the lives of the people she quietly helped, and she never sealed the iron door on the ridge again. When she died, on a May morning, with June the Australian shepherd at the foot of her bed, the door was still standing open, and the room behind it was still full, and the light was still coming in the east window of the reading room across the hall, and somewhere at the edge of the orchard, the flat stone over Shep's grave was warm in the sun. The house she left went to a foundation she had established in her grandmother Etta's name. The working land went, as she had always intended it to Wendell's youngest grandchild, a girl of 19 who had started at the community college in Grand Island, studying, of all things, bookkeeping. The girl came up the ridge the week after the funeral, and she stood on the porch Maggie had rebuilt, and she cried. And then she went inside, and she walked up the stairs to the back of the hall, and she stood in front of the open iron door, and she looked in. And what Maggie Holloway had written out, in her own hand, in the last year of her life, and left framed on the little wooden desk inside that room, said only this: "Every door that was locked still holds a key. If you are reading this, then the key has come to you. Do not be afraid of what is inside. Do not be afraid of what others told you is not there. The world will ask you, all your life, to believe that the room is empty. The room is never empty. You are never too old, and it is never too late, and you are not alone. Someone who loved you is always on the other side of the door, waiting for you to be ready. Be gentle with what you find. Be generous with what it gives you. And when your time comes, leave the key for whoever walks up the ridge after you. Thank you so much for staying until the very end. Stories like this one remind us that the most important doors haven't been opened yet. If this moved you, there are more stories waiting for you on your screen right now. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect time. I don't want you to miss what's coming. See you in the next story.